So the new right is unanimously concerned about immigration. And everybody wants something done about the mass immigration into North America, into Europe, and in the migrant crisis in Europe. And everybody seems to be of the opinion that the great multicultural experiment, the open borders experiment, has failed. But as of this point, there's no one agreed upon solution or even goal for how to fix this problem. And people fall into one of two camps. There are the civic nationalists, and those would be the classical liberals, the libertarians, the MAGA crowd, and the other would be the ethno-nationalists. And these are the European advocates, the pro-European crowd, the identitarians. And so these groups both want something done about immigration, but they can't agree on an objective. And their current objectives seem to be even opposed to each other. And because we have the civic nationalist camp, they look at the ethno-nationalists and say, oh, this is repugnant, this is repulsive, identity politics are horrific, they're untenable, and the left is using identity politics right now, and so it's just two sides of the same coin. There's always some variation on this old argument. And then the ethno-nationalist side looks at the civic nationalists and says, well, your plan is completely unrealistic. How are you going to save your countries, your continent, through what? Through promotion of your culture, and that's, it's bound for failure. We're already seeing evidence of that in society right now. And so who's right here? Whose plan is more practical, more likely to succeed? Well, the ethno-nationalists fundamentally want to preserve European people for their own sake. Full stop. And that's why focusing on other lesser concerns like the legality of the immigrants from the perspective of ethno-nationalists completely misses the point, because to emphasize the legality and to just focus on to focus your outrage on the fact that these people are illegal, well, that would mean that the flooding of Europe with non-European people, the displacement of whites in their own countries, that would all be acceptable as long as the immigrants coming in do so through the proper legal channels, right? So as long as the immigrants fill out the proper paperwork, they pay some fees, they dot their I's, cross their T's, well, in that case, all of this would be acceptable. Now, the civic nationalists don't care about the demographics of the West, and they never say that outright, but it's built into their logic, it's built into their entire reasoning and ideology. Because the civic nationalist still does want to preserve their country in some way. They do want to preserve their way of life, but they put the emphasis on culture, and they attribute their entire way of life, their nation, everything to culture. And some will even go as far as to call themselves Western chauvinists. But this fixation on culture is based in flawed logic, because this presupposes that culture is separate from people, right? It's a metaphysical idea of culture, that culture is some kind of an ether cloud hovering above different countries, different territorial borders. And so if people walk into the borders of one culture, they can adopt that. And if they walk out, then they can lose that culture and adopt a new culture. And the culture is just this abstract thing that doesn't have any actual connection to the people. And this fixation on culture also comes down to the nature versus nurture question. What is the basis for human behavior? Because if it's nurture, well, then the civic nationalist argument would make complete sense. Because we can take in all kinds of immigrants from all around the world, from any demographic, and we'll just simply nurture them to be like us. Well, is that possible? Can that be achieved? Well, researchers have been working on answering that question for the past half a century in the form of twin studies. And what they do is they take identical twins. Now, identical twins share all their DNA, and they take identical twins, often who have been separated at birth. They might not even know that they have a twin. And they get these twins and they bring them together in adulthood and study them. And what the researchers have found is that twins that have been separated from birth, they have had no contact with each other, sometimes have lived in opposite ends of the planet, different religions, different countries. They still have an enormous amount of traits. These are abilities, personality quirks, personality types, intelligence. They have a huge amount in common. And so what this has told us is that an enormous amount of our behavior and everything about us is genetic in origin. It doesn't come from the country we live in, the religion we're raised in, the families. Every trait is, to some degree, heritable. And now, you might be thinking, that's all well and good, but that still doesn't explain the differences that we see between racial groups, for some indefinable reason. That difference has something to do with socioeconomics or some other factor. Well, this thought has also occurred to researchers. And so what they did to try to get to the bottom of this was they did interracial adoption studies, where they followed white and non-white kids who were adopted into middle-class white households. And the idea was that, these adoptive parents these are generally well-adjusted, well-off people. They usually have a decent level of education, income, and therefore all of the children that they adopt will essentially turn out just like the parents. They'll be nurtured to have an IQ similar to the parents, that they'll achieve things similar to the parents. And so what they did is the researchers gave IQ tests to the kids at a very young age, and then again in their later teen years when this kind of thing is more stabilized. And what they found is that the adoptive children's IQs did not correspond with the adoptive parents. And in fact, the kids all fell in line with the group averages of their racial group. And now, when the researchers went in to do this study, they were very confident that they would be able to show that essentially the black-white IQ difference was all cultural, it's all socioeconomic, and despite all their high hopes, they could not make the adopted kids into middle-class white people. And so this is all the research that the civic nationalist needs to come up with an answer for. Okay, because really, massive interracial immigration is just interracial adoption on a civilizational scale. So if you do hold that civic nationalist position, you need to come up with a way to explain why all of this psychological and genetic and behavioral research doesn't apply in this one instance. And I would argue, as the ethno-nationalists argue, that no, all of this research is evidence that we can't nurture genetically distant people to behave like each other. And that demographic change will ultimately lead to cultural change. And that's the origin of the phrase, demographics is destiny. And when you look at all this research, when you look at the twin studies, the interracial adoption studies, it also coincides with everything that we see in the world. Anywhere that a large number of European people have moved into throughout the world has essentially been turned into something similar to Europe. Anywhere around the world in which a large number of African people have moved into has essentially been turned into something similar to Africa. And this is exactly the result you would expect based on all of that research. And so ultimately, what this all comes down to is that even if you don't care about European people, you don't care about preserving European people for their own sake, you don't care about demographics at all, even if all you care about is preserving culture, Western culture, the only way to preserve that culture is to preserve the people who produce that culture. And so ultimately, all roads end up leading back to ethno-nationalism.